Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I'm going to start here with chapter 4. Until now we have talked about chapter 4, the 8 verses on transforming the mind. Until now we have talked about the basis that makes spiritual transformation possible, about the need for training the mind. The most essential point is the development of bodhicitta, the altruistic intention to attain enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, which arises from training in the two aspirations. As a means to enhance our practice, it is advised that we should constantly apply it in our daily life and to our behavior as a whole, physical, verbal, and mental. Verbal action includes reading texts like the 8 verses on transforming the mind, which is presented here as an aid to constantly remind you of the importance of undertaking this kind of contemplation. Let us situate the practice of bodhicitta within the content of Tibetan Buddhism as a whole. Tibetan Buddhism can be described as the most comprehensive system of Buddhism, in the sense that it contains elements of all the aspects of the Buddha's teaching, including Vajrayana. The teachings of the Four Noble Truths form the core of the non-Mahayana teachings and are really the foundation of the Buddhist path. Together with the training in morality, the Four Noble Truths also serve as the basis for the practice of bodhicitta. The development of bodhicitta is the core of the Buddha's teaching. Don't move that, please. Sorry, guys. No, you may not. And the main core of the Buddha's teaching and the main path. Once the development of the bodhicitta has taken place, the practitioner endeavors to apply the altruistic principle throughout his or her life. This leads to what are known as the Bodhisattva ideals, including the 6 perfections. The perfections of generosity, morality, patience, enthusiasm, meditation, or concentration, and wisdom. Of these 6, the last 2 are perhaps the most important, because it is in the context of the perfection of concentration and insight that the Vajrayana methods are introduced. We can consider the Vajrayana teachings as more refined methods for realizing the perfection of concentration and wisdom. The highest practice for perfecting these, from the Tibetan Buddhist point of view, is said to be the highest Yoga Tantra, where a detailed explanation of the subtle levels of consciousness can be found. The point I wish to make here is that the practice of compassion is at the heart of the entire path. All other practices are either preliminary to it, or a foundation for it, or they are subsequent applications of this core practice. I would also like to point out that there is a consensus between all Buddhist schools on this in both Mahayana and non-Mahayana traditions, so compassion lies at the root of all the Buddhist teachings. But it is within the Bodhisattva ideal that we find special emphasis on the concentrated development of compassion by means of cultivating bodhicitta. The 8 verses. With a determination to achieve the highest aim for the benefit of all sentient beings, which surpasses even the wish-fulfilling gem. May I hold them dear at all times. The first verse begins in Tibetan with a reference to the self, and we touch briefly on the question of self in chapter 1. We will now pursue this issue further. The analysis of the nature and existence of self is really critical for an understanding of the Buddhist path. We could say that there are 2 main camps on this issue within Buddhism. On the one hand, there are Buddhist schools which, although they reject the self as an internal principle or eternal soul, argue that a self or person or individual must be identified in relation to the mind-body aggregates. For instance, some schools posit the person as the total collection of the 5 aggregates. Others argue that it is the mental consciousness that is the real person or self. The Indian master Bhavanivika, for example, identified the 6th mental consciousness as a person in the final analysis. However, other schools, such as the mind-only school, are not satisfied with the identification of the person with a mental consciousness. They posit a separate facility called the fundamental consciousness, which is said to remain constant, ever-present, and continuous. It is also said to be neutral and acts as a repository for the many propensities that exist in our mind stream. So this group of Buddhist schools attempts to identify the self objectively with the mind-body complex. Why did the mind-only school feel the need to posit a fundamental consciousness separate from our general mental consciousness? They found there are instances in life, particularly for a highly evolved mediator in total equipoise on emptiness, when no aspect of the meditator's consciousness is polluted, yet he or she has not attained full enlightenment. So the mental pollutants and their imprints must still reside somewhere. This is why they felt the need to posit a separate facility called the foundational consciousness, which is by its very nature a neutral state. On the other side, there is a school of Buddhism called Prasangika Madhyamaka, which rejects any need to posit the self objectively as an inherently existing entity. They argue that we cannot posit either the self or things and events as possessing independent objects, reality. One must understand the existence of the self or person as they construe it in relation to the mind-body complex, something that is imputed on the basis of mind and body, but that has no independent existence or inherent identity. From the second and more profound point of view, we say that the self is a designation imputed to the complex of mind-body aggregates. The Prasangikas maintain that the nature of self is such that when you actually begin to search for its real existence on the basis of its alleged physical and mental constituents, you cannot find anything that can be identified as the real self. Prasangika Madhyamaka subjects the notion of self to what is called the 7-point analysis, and finally states that since a self or person cannot be found when we analyze our body and mind, we should not conclude that it does not exist at all, but rather that it exists as a designation. One of the implications that they draw from this approach is that we should not engage in excessive analysis and try to posit a metaphysical reality to self. Rather, we should accept the reality of the self or person on the basis of general convention, and should not investigate beyond that. So when you begin to appreciate that the reality of self can be accepted as valid only at the level of popular convention, and at the level of linguistic usage, then you realize that one cannot posit any objective inherent reality to it. Furthermore, you also come to realize that the self has no independent identity of its own, and does not exist inherently. Persons do not exit in and of themselves, but merely within the context of language and the understanding that prevails in the transactional world. This analysis is a very skillful way to gain insight into the emptiness of persons. The Prasangikas are suggested that persons are somehow real in name and concept, but not in objective reality. However, this concept is slightly different from the notion of abstract entities held by other Buddhist schools, which likewise say that entities are real only in name and concept. It is important not to be confused by this. Although the same term may be used by different Buddhist schools, its meaning may change in different contexts and when used by different philosophers. This is true, for instance, of the word for intrinsic nature, svabhava. We sometimes find the word used in the writings of the Prasangika Madhyamaka philosopher. Oh. Elena, will you not yell, please? Excuse me. Who rejected the notion of inherent existence. The mere fact that they use the word in some contexts does not mean that they accept inherent existence. It is therefore important to be sensitive to the specific content in which a word appears. Will you tell her to be quiet, please? Tell her to be quiet. Never mind. Sorry, guys. When we refer... Will you shut the door then? Because she is too loud. When we refer to the I in the context of the 8 verses, therefore, we should not see it as some form of objectively real or substantially existent self. We should always bear in mind that the self is understood as the conventional person. In this verse, you are making the aspiration to hold all other sentient beings as supremely dear to you, because they are the basis upon which you can achieve the highest goal, which is the welfare of sentient beings. This goal surpasses even the legendary wish-fulfilling jewel, because however precious such a jewel may be, it cannot provide the highest spiritual attainment. There's also a reference here to the kindness of all other beings, and we spoke of the meaning of this earlier. For a Mahayana practitioner especially, it is due to other sentient beings that you can develop great compassion, the highest spiritual principle, and it is thanks to other sentient beings that you can develop bodhicitta, the altruistic intention. So it is on the basis of your interaction with others that you can attain the highest spiritual realization. From that point of view, the kindness of others is very profound. We found a similar principle at work in other fields of spiritual practice, such as the 3 higher trainings, the trainings in morality, meditation, and insight. The role played by others is very important in these trainings, right from the start. Let's take, for example, the higher training in morality. The essence of the Buddhist training in morality is the ethics of restraint. That is, refraining from harming others, and the core practice is refraining from the 10 negative actions, the first of which is not to kill. So the very first practice of ethical discipline, not to kill, is directly connected with the value of the role played by others. Furthermore, according to Buddhism, some of the positive qualities that we desire in life, such as longevity, an attractive appearance, being wealthy, having all one needs, and so on, these are all said to be the karmic results of your interaction with others. Longevity, for instance, is said to be an effective of the ethical practice of refraining from killing. Being physically attractive is said to result from being patient with others. Being well provided for is seen as the result of having been generous towards others in one's previous life, and so on. So even the mundane advantages that we strive for are considered to be the fruit of our interactions with others. When we talk of cultivating the thought of holding others as supremely dear, it is important to understand that we are not cultivating the kind of pity that we sometimes feel towards someone who is less fortunate than ourselves. With pity, there can be a tendency to look down upon the object of our compassion, and to feel a sense of superiority, holding others dear is in fact the reverse of this. In this practice, by recognizing the kindness of others and how indispensable they are for our own spiritual progress, we appreciate their tremendous importance and significance, and therefore we naturally accord them a higher status in our minds. It is because we think of them in this way that we are able to relate to them as dear and as worthy of our respect and affection. Because of this, the next verse reads, "Whenever I interact with someone, may I view myself as the lowest amongst all, and from the very depths of my heart, respectfully hold others as superior." This verse suggests the kind of attitude that I have just described. The idea of seeing oneself as lower than others should not be misconstrued as a way of neglecting ourselves, ignoring our needs, or feeling that we are a hopeless case. Rather, as I explained earlier, it stems from a courageous state of mind where you are able to relate to others, fully aware of what ability you have to help. So please do not misunderstand this point. What is being suggested here is the need for genuine humility. I would like to tell a story to illustrate this. There was a great Dzogchen master about 2 or 3 generations ago called Dza, D-Z-A, Paltrul Rinpoche. Not only was he a great master, but he had a large following, and he would often give teachings to thousands of students. But he was also a meditator, so occasionally he would disappear to do a retreat somewhere, and his students would have to run around to search for him. During one of those breaks, he was on a pilgrimage, and he stayed for a couple of days with a family. Like many Tibetan pilgrims did, they would seek shelter with a family on the road and do some chores in return for food. So Dza Paltrul Rinpoche did various chores for the family, including emptying the mother's potty, which he did on a regular basis. Eventually, some of his students arrived in that region and heard that Dza Paltrul Rinpoche was somewhere around, and a number of monks finally reached this household and approached the mother of the house. "Do you know where Dza Paltrul Rinpoche is?" they asked. "I don't know of any Dza Paltrul Rinpoche around here," she replied. The monks then described him to her and added, "We heard he was living in your house as a pilgrim." "Oh," she cried, "that is Dza Paltrul Rinpoche." Apparently, just at that moment, he had gone to empty her potty. The mother was so horrified that she ran away. What this story tells us is that even in a great Lama like Dza Paltrul Rinpoche, who had a following of thousands, and who was used to giving teachings from a high throne surrounded by many monks and so on, there was a genuine humility. He had no hesitation when it came to doing a chore like emptying a potty of an elderly lady. There are particular ways in which one can practice viewing oneself as lower than others. To take a simple example, we all know from experience that when we focus on a particular object or individual, according to the angle from which we view it, we will have a different perspective. This is, in fact, the nature of thought. Thoughts are capable of selecting only isolated characteristics of given objects at a particular time. Human thought is not capable of comprehensively viewing something in its entirety. The nature of thought is to be selective. When you realize this, you can view yourself as lower than others from a certain point of view, even in comparison to a tiny insect. Let's say that I compare myself to an insect. I am a follower of the Buddha, and a human being equipped with the capacity to think and supposedly to be able to judge between right and wrong. I am also supposed to have some knowledge of the fundamental teachings of the Buddha. And and theoretically, I am committed to these practices. Yet when I find certain negative tendencies arising in me, or when I carry out negative actions on the basis of these impulses, then from that point of view there is certainly a case to be made that I am in some ways inferior to the insect. After all, an insect is not able to judge between right and wrong in the way humans can. It has no capacity to think in a long-term way, and is unable to understand the intricacies, intricacies of spiritual teachings. So from the Buddha's point of view, whatever an insect does is the result of habituation and karma. By comparison, human beings have the ability to determine what they do. If despite this, we act negatively when it could be argued that we are inferior to that innocent insect. So when you think along these lines, there are genuine grounds for seeing ourselves as inferior to all other sentient beings. The third verse reads, "In all my deeds may I probe into my mind, and as soon as mental and emotional afflictions arise, as they endanger myself and others, may I strongly confront them and avert them." This indicates that although all of us as spiritual practitioners wish to overcome our negative impulses, thoughts, and emotions owing to our long habituation to negative tendencies and to our lack of diligence in applying the necessary antidotes to them, effective emotions and thoughts do occur in us spontaneously and quite powerfully. Such is their force, in fact, that when we are often driven by these negative tendencies, this verse suggests we should be aware of this fact so that we remain alert. We should constantly check ourselves and take note when negative tendencies arise in us so that we can catch them as they arise. If we do this, then we will not give in to them. We will be able to remain on our guard and keep a certain distance from them. In this way, we won't reinforce them, and we will be spared from undergoing an explosion of strong emotion and the negative words and actions to which that leads. But generally, this is not what happens. Even if we know that negative emotions are destructive, if they are not very intense, we tend to think, oh, maybe one is okay. We tend to treat them rather cautiously. The problem is that the longer you are accustomed to the afflictions within you, the more prone you become to their reoccurring, and then the greater your propensity will be to give in to them. This is how negativity perpetuates itself, so it is important to be mindful as the text urges, so that whenever affliction emotions arise, you are able to confront them and avert them immediately. Earlier, I pointed out that the Buddhist teaching must be understood in relation to the goal of attaining freedom from suffering, and that the heart of the Buddhist spiritual practice is therefore to work with negative tendencies. It is very important, especially for a Buddhist practitioner, to constantly check oneself in daily life, to check one's thoughts and feelings, even, if possible, during one's dreams. As you train yourself in the application of mindfulness, gradually you will be able to apply it more and more regularly, and its effectiveness as a tool will increase. The next verse reads, "When I see beings of unpleasant character, oppressed by strong negativity and suffering, may I hold them dear, for they are rare to find, as if I have discovered a jewel treasure." This verse refers to the special case of relating to people who are socially marginalized, perhaps because of their behavior, their appearance, their destitution, destitution, not destination, destitution, or an account of some illness. Whoever practices bodhicitta must take special care of these people, as if, on meeting them, you have found a real treasure. Instead of feeling repulsed, a true practitioner of these altruistic principles should engage and take on the challenge of relating. In fact, the way we interact with people of this kind could give a great impetus to our spiritual practice. In this content, I would like to point out the great example set by many Christian brothers and sisters who engage in the humanitarian and caring professions, especially directed to marginalized members of society. One such example in our times was the late Mother Teresa, who dedicated her life to caring for the destitutes. She exemplified the ideal that is described in this verse. It is on account of this important point that when I met members of Buddhist centers in various parts of the world, I often point out to them that it is not sufficient for a Buddhist center simply to have programs of teaching or meditation. There are, of course, very impressive Buddhist centers and some retreat centers where the Western monks have been trained so well that they are capable of playing the clarinet in the traditional Tibetan way. But I also emphasize to them the need to bring the social and caring dimension into their program of activities, so that the principles presented in the Buddhist teaching can make a contribution to society. I am glad to say that I have heard that some Buddhist centers are beginning to apply Buddhist principles socially. For example, I believe that in Australia there are Buddhist centers which are establishing hospice and helping dying people, and caring for patients with AIDS. I have also heard of Buddhist centers involved in some form of spiritual education in prisons, where they give talks and offer counseling. Will you tell him to stop yelling, please? I think these are great examples. It is, of course, deeply unfortunate when such people, particularly prisoners, feel rejected by society. Not only is it deeply painful for them, but also, from a broader point of view, it is a loss for society. We are not providing the opportunity for these people to make a constructive social contribution when they actually have the potential to do so. I therefore think it is important for society as a whole not to reject such individuals, but to embrace them and acknowledge the potential contribution. Hold on, please.
Now can we watch it?
No, you're not watching a show. Will you let me finish, please?
Fine.
They can make. In this way, they will feel they have a place in society and will begin to think that they might perhaps have something to offer. Oof. How many more pages? Alright guys, I'm going to have to stop right there. About halfway through. Thanks for listening.